Hello and welcome to our discourse. I'm your host Jonathan Deon, and today I have Mr. Franco Di Nardo, who is a student of architecture from Argentina, Buenos Aires. Franco will discuss us about architecture. What is architecture? Some examples of good architecture, some examples of bad architecture, so we could all enrich our knowledge. Before I approach you, Franco, I'd like to disclaimer the viewers that I am not an expert in architecture, so please take whatever I say with a grain of salt. I'm here to learn from you, Mr. Franco, and I hope most of our viewers will also learn about this most intriguing and important form of art. Franco, please.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, Jonathan. As you said, I am a student of architecture, so I'm no expert either, but I guess I have a couple of thoughts that may be interesting to you, so I'm happy to share them.
Great. So, alright, let us begin with the first question, the most fundamental question. Please tell us briefly, what is even architecture?
Well, I would say architecture is the art or the science of designing and building spaces in which human activity takes place. I say it's both an art and a science because it definitely has artistic components, but it's also very different from the traditional arts, let's say painting, sculpture, music. And it's different because it has a function that goes beyond contemplation. Architecture is utilitarian in the sense that it solves a problem. The problem may be related to housing or an institutional building, or it's a place where something needs to happen, and in that sense it goes way beyond the traditional arts.
The function will always come before beauty, right? Where in paintings it will be absolute opposite because there is no function to painting other than contemplation, right?
Exactly, and you couldn't conceive of an architectural piece that's just for contemplation. It wouldn't be useful. It wouldn't make any sense. You actually want to use the building in some way.
Would that be sculpture right? It would be kind of a statue, something which has no function, a building without any function.
Yes, exactly. It would be something like that.
Okay, so please tell us how does one become an architect? Why is it so? It's considered a very desired occupation, which is different than being a painter or a sculptor. Someone who is an architect, you think of him very highly as like a doctor. So what is so special about architecture in that aspect?
Well, architecture, it's seen sometimes in history as the mother of all arts. And if you think about it, there is a sense in which all the arts kind of come together in architecture. It has certainly some aspects of sculpture in the sense that our object of study and design is a three-dimensional object. It's also not an object, actually. It's a structure which creates spaces, and it goes beyond that. But you can see the connection to sculpture. But if you think about painting and even music, there is something of that in architecture. Buildings do have, let's say, a rhythm that you can see with repeating elements like columns or windows.
They have music.
Exactly. And different buildings and different cities have different rhythms that go with them. And I say cities because a city is also a collection of buildings. So architecture has buildings as its subject of study and uh, design, and also cities, because when you have a lot of buildings, well, they kind of make a city.
So the architect also has to, when he's, for example, designing a building in a neighborhood, he also has to take into account the surrounding area, which is very different than a painter or any other form of art, because it doesn't matter, right? You could hang in any gallery, but the building is there to stay, and it has to it has to go well with its surroundings. It can't just pop out. There are very ugly examples for that when it does happen.
Exactly. Yes, I do have a couple of examples to show you later about the importance of taking context into account and not designing a piece that's completely alien to its surroundings, because, well, it can have problems, as you said.
So the architect has to also, first of all, he has to have an idea for what kind of building he's commissioned to create. He has to have design ideas, but he also has to take a more holistic view of the whole area in which his building is constructed. He also has to take into account the clients, what do they want. Well, if he is like commissioned to create a certain a gas station, he needs to create a gas station. It needs to be functional. So that is very, very different than every other art. So would you say like every building is art, or it's different? Maybe there are just purely functionalistic buildings. I can think of Soviet buildings, for example, which has absolutely no beauty. Could that be art?
Well, in regard to this, I'd like to read you a quote from the Fountainhead that I really like, and that I think illustrates, let's say, the purpose of architecture. Howard Rourke says this: "Nothing can be reasonable or beautiful unless it's made by one central idea, and the idea sets every detail. A building is alive, like a man. Its integrity is to follow its own truth, its own single theme, and to serve its own single purpose. A man doesn't borrow pieces of his body, a building doesn't borrow hunks of its soul. Its maker gives it the soul and every wall, window, and stairway to express it." So this goes back to the idea of having an idea when you design a building, and having everything around that idea. It's a place of integration, right? So I think a good building and good architecture has integration, and every component of it is in accordance, or at least not in contradiction, with the central idea.
And that's very, very difficult. Yeah, I asked you about buildings who are purely functional. For example, Soviet buildings were just rectangles with windows. These can be considered art?
I would say no. There's a definition of what good architecture is that has been given by a man named Vitruvius in the 1st century, and I think it's right. So I'd like to share with you these concepts. Please. That he introduced. He talks about, well, it's in Latin, so firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, which is durability, functionality, and beauty. This is known as the Vitruvian triad. So what does it mean for a building to have durability or firmness, you could say? Well, it is kind of obvious. It has to stand
earthquakes.
Earthquakes, the rain, the weather. It has to
not collapse.
Stand in time. Yeah, not collapse. And that's a very obvious aspect. All the buildings that we know of kind of check this durability mark, because otherwise they wouldn't be there. They would collapse. Um, then utilitas, functionality. This has to do with the building being functional, accomplishing the purpose for which it was built or for which it was designed. I don't know if this happened to you, but sometimes when you're in a building, it may feel kind of awkward, like walls are where they shouldn't be and spaces have weird proportions or weird shapes, and you have to walk in a weird.
Yeah, I know. There's very famous building in Tel Aviv, a mall. It's called the Dizengoff Center, and the whole mall is built purposefully in an uncomfortable way to navigate it. You go like that, and you go up, and you go down, and it's like a maze. After thousands of times there, I can navigate that. I know how to walk across it, but many people get lost there all the time. So I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, because functionality in a building is usually seen in a floor plan. Let's say how the circulation is laid out. It's called a layout also. Where are the different rooms? Kind of how is it going to be used, the building? So I think also Howard Work in the Fountainhead is known for making these amazing layouts where everything flows and you can find your way around, and that's something that sets him apart from other architects in the novel. And then we have beauty. This is the aesthetic component, the aesthetical component. And then we have beauty. Beauty is the aesthetical element in architecture. And according to Vitruvius, beautiful buildings or beauty in architecture was in imitating nature. And imitating nature in a particular respect. If you think about it, what is the most important element in nature that you have to take into account when you build something? Probably the answer is gravity, the fact that things fall to the ground. This gives you certain ideas like, okay, maybe it's logical to put the bigger and heavier things at the bottom and the lighter and smaller things on top, because otherwise it's very unstable, right? You can see this logic in a lot of natural structures. For example, the trees, right? You have the trunk, then the branches, then the leaves, so it gets lighter as you move upwards. Well, the same idea can be applied to architecture. In a building, you have different elements, right? You have the columns, the roof, the windows, and each element has some sort of visual weight. And arranging them with heavier ones at the bottom and the lighter ones on top is usually a good decision. According to Vitruvius, that's what contributes to beauty in architecture. I have an example here of a building that doesn't do that, which is this one. And the impression that I got when I saw this image is this is unsettling. It probably won't fall because it probably has been calculated and there was an engineer and all of that. But still, it looks like it's going to fall, right? It looks very unstable and very unnatural. So I think Vitruvius wouldn't consider this like a beautiful building.
I think he would be amazed by it, Vitruvius, if he saw that.
Yeah, this is one can be amazed with how technology has progressed so that we can build these kind of things. That's surprising, and that's all human ingenuity and technological development. But maybe the word beautiful doesn't come to mind, right?
Yeah.
as opposed to, for example, something like this. Um, and simply judging by how it behaves in relation to gravity, right? Bigger things at the bottom, smaller things at the top, and it looks more like a mountain rather than whatever the picture in the left
Yeah.
looks like. It's like
My
an inverted
example,
mountain.
my example would be the Empire State Building, for a building that goes like that.
Sure, yeah, you can see how it gets smaller as you go upward. Yeah, that's a great example.
Okay, so there's architecture that is beautiful. There's architecture that is ugly. And well, I'm not sure if this example was ugly, but it was as you said, it can cause some unusual feelings. It can evoke fear, angst, and maybe that's not what you're looking for in your building. But still, I'm very curious about this. So architecture. Every building is a work of architecture, right? But for example, in painting, I wouldn't say that everything that every paint that you throw at a canvas is art. So where is the line there? Do you think there's a line? Do you think you know maybe you can give us an indication, because I know it's a very difficult thing to determine, but I'm always curious about this line. Where does the art stop?
Yeah, as you said, it is a very difficult subject, and I don't have a clear answer. I would say that there are buildings that definitely don't have the aesthetical component. Some of them do it explicitly. There are some architects, or are some architects that hold that beauty has nothing to do with architecture, or rather, it has nothing to do with arranging elements peacefully or harmonically, but rather with other aspects like functionality. This is something that the modern movement states. I'm talking about, for example, Le Corbusier, which is a very known Swiss-French architect from the modern movement. If you see modern architecture, it's just ugly, because they held that beauty was in the function, right? And they had this idea that adding elements were just for aesthetical purposes,
Yeah,
like it
ornaments.
was ornaments. They were kind of unethical. They were like cheating, because a building should be beautiful in itself without something added on it, right?
I think of brutalism when you say that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, brutalism is the style that shows the materials in their very raw state, or like they try to not um how do you
Decorate.
say it? Yeah, they
They just show
like
you the concrete.
every material that they use has to be perceivable, has to be shown, has to be really out there. Not necessarily concrete. It can be steel or
Well,
bricks
the
or wood.
ugliest examples would be just the gray concrete, which is also very depressing in my opinion.
I agree. Yeah, that's to me an example of cases in which aesthetics is not considered.
But going back to the Vitruvius triangle, I think the architect has a very difficult assignment here, because he needs to play with this with the right balance. Because if he needs to build a train station, and he has a limited budget, he has to. It's very difficult to navigate between, having the perfect enough beauty, or making the building as functional as possible. So there's really like a chess game that he has to play.
Yes, yes, you could say that. It's well, that's the job of the architect, right? Delivering the best product possible with the limited resources that he has or that the client has. Sometimes it is right to sacrifice, or to not sacrifice, but you have to have a clear hierarchy of values, let's say, about what's the most important thing about this building. It's a train station, okay. It certainly has to function as a train station, right?
Yeah.
Can it have a lot of ornaments? Yes, but it's not necessary. You can make it very simple and still beautiful, because beauty is not about adding ornaments. It's also about proportions
And
to
harmony.
things being
Yeah.
exactly things being well proportioned and well scaled according to a standard which has changed along history, but I would say our standard is us humans. So yes, sometimes, and that's where ingenuity comes into play, because you may think that everything has been invented in architecture. Of course, that's not true. There are a lot of solutions that one has to come up with kind of in the moment in order to solve these issues about a limited budget, for example. And that's part of the job of the architect, to do the most with the resources that he has, that may be scarce sometimes.
Okay. Would you like now to go over a bit of history about the Greek and the Romans and their revolutionary approach to architecture?
Sure. Yes, let me share my screen. So, yeah, we're taking Greece and Rome as, or at least I take them as, the starting point of beautiful architecture. They had different approaches, and these two images illustrate these different approaches. What you're looking at is two theaters. So the function of these two buildings is the same. The left one is a Greek amphitheater, and the right one is the Roman Colosseum. Both are theaters, have the same function, but notice how they are very different in one respect, at least one, which is their relation to nature. The Greeks were very more in harmony with nature, let's say. Greece has a terrain that's naturally with a lot of hills and slopes, and the Greeks learned to take advantage of that. And for example, did a theater in which every spectator could see the show. They take advantage of the slope and build it in the hill, in the slope. So it's a way of harmonizing architecture with nature. The Romans, on the other hand, they were more, think about them as they were an empire. They were powerful, and they expanded all over the Mediterranean, and they kind of showed it with their architecture. So they don't need a hill or a slope in order to build a theater. They're going to build a theater wherever they want to, because that's the way they approach the issue of architecture, right? So both the Greek and the Romans, they they master nature, you could say, but with different techniques. So one is more in harmony with nature, the other one is more building on top of nature.
But still, they both preferred their own flourishing over nature. And I'm just thinking about environmentalism, for example. You cannot really do architecture on environmentalist premise, because you have to transform nature to do architecture, and
Exactly.
so if you are coming from a perspective that you shouldn't change nature because nature is naturally perfect, so how could you do architecture?
Yeah, that to me is a key point about architecture. Architecture is about transforming nature in order to serve our needs. That's the way we survive as human beings, and that's what we've been doing since always. Only since the Greeks, or maybe you could say the Egyptians, um, we developed it and refined it, because we weren't building shelters out of wood that would maybe collapse with the first storm, but we've been building more durable architecture. But yeah, definitely, if you live on a premise about not altering nature in any way, um, you simply couldn't do any architecture, because that's the
Well, you
definition of
couldn't
architecture.
leave, but but also you couldn't do architecture, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Because the purpose of architecture is to help you live, is to create the spaces in which you do your daily activities.
Yeah, but it's
Um,
not just a mud house. It's building theaters like the Greek did. It's about flourishing. It's about also leisurely activities, not only functional, just basic. A house made of mud. Maybe that the environmentalists would allow for that, but they would definitely not allow for a theater.
yes, and uh, in regard to this, I want you to look at this. This is a very good example of human beings, the Romans in this case, altering nature in order to fit their needs. The Romans were, I would say, the first engineers, if you want to put it that way. On the left, you see a Roman aqueduct, which was a device to bring fresh water into the cities. And on the right, you see public toilets. Think about how important these inventions are. Um, Going from nothing to having fresh water in the cities and having a sewage system that works because it worked, is amazing. And you couldn't have done any of it uh, while not touching nature and leaving it as it is.
Absolutely. Although I would never go to such a place to.
No, of course, but it's an improvement, right? You
Yeah,
either go in your own backyard or,
to the
or
river.
whatever, or you have a primitive sewage system. That's that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then another significant period in architecture is the Renaissance. I really like the Renaissance. As you may know, because it also happens with the other arts, with painting and such, the Renaissance was a period in which the Roman and Greek way to do things was rediscovered, or kind of brought back to use. And this happened in architecture too. This is an example that I really like about Renaissance architecture, and this is a church in Italy. I want you to look at this facade for a minute. So you may see a couple of what we call architectural motifs here. This facade resembles two things at once, I would say: a Greek temple and a Roman triumphal arch. Now, what does a Greek temple mean? Well, the Greek temple was a building that was the house of a god. Humans, the Greeks, didn't enter their temples. There were holy places that were appreciated from the outside. In a sense, they were kind of like a sculpture, kind of, if you want to think about
But
it in those
they
terms.
built it for the gods, right?
Right. It was a house of a god. Are you a god? No, then you can't go inside. But then there's the Roman triumphal arch. These were arches that were built in order to celebrate something, to commemorate maybe a victory in a battle. It was sometimes built in order to welcome back the soldiers that returned victorious from battle. So the idea of the Roman arch is, come in. I'm opening my arms. Come in through the arch and be how would you say it?
Feel at home. Be
exalted.
Yeah.
Yes, like so combine two things, and what you get is a building that is the house of a god, but that is also welcoming you, because it's kind of telling you, you are a god. Come in, feel at home. And that's kind of the feeling that I get from Renaissance architecture. It's architecture that's built for men, for humans. Even though it is a religious building and it is a place of worship of a god, of the Catholic god, it's still built for humans. And in relation to this, I want to bring another quote from the Fountainhead. If you remember, Rourke builds at some point the Stoddard Temple.
Yeah.
And the description that we get of this temple is this: when a man entered this temple, he would feel space molded around him, for him, as if it had waited for his entrance to be completed. It was a joyous place, with a joy of exaltation that must be quiet. It was a place where one would come to feel sinless and strong, to find the peace of spirit never granted save for one's own glory. This is the general feel that I got from the building that I just showed you. And
very nice, very cool. I never felt something like that from a building.
Yeah, and it's very different to look at it in a picture and be there, of course.
Right.
But yeah, I think good architecture should probably make you feel this.
Wow.
And you may contrast this with the Gothic style in architecture. This was popularized in the medieval period. It was a very religious period that was mainly focused on God. So these Gothic cathedrals, Gothic churches, were built for gods, not for humans. They were designed in order to make you feel small, to make you fearful of the power of God that is always watching you, right? They even designed these gargoyles, right? These monsters that lurk from above, and I mean, it's just so anti-life, right? So anti-human. But coming back to the Renaissance, this, you may have seen this drawing before. It's from Leonardo da Vinci. It's the Vitruvian Man. If you remember, Vitruvius was the one with the triangle, right?
Right.
Firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. So this is a drawing by Da Vinci based on the writings of Vitruvius. Vitruvius, I don't know if I mentioned this, but he wrote the first treatise on architecture that we know of. And he devoted a lot of it to explain proportions and the importance of things being well proportioned and well scaled in architecture. So he studies proportions in relation to the human body, right? How many times does our head fit in our total height, for example? How many times does our hand fit in our arm? These kinds of things. If you stretch your arms horizontally, you may see that from finger to finger, it's almost the same length as your total height. If you extend your limbs and imagine a circle or a circumference, the center of it would be your belly button. And those kind of relationships that completed this mindset of the man as a center, as our focus. We should build for man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this helped a lot develop another tool that was very used in the Renaissance, which is the perspective. You can see this in painting too. Before the Renaissance, paintings were very flat, right? They wouldn't be so three-dimensional.
They were frontal. The subjects were facing the front. They didn't have any depth to them.
Exactly. And when you develop the proper method to draw something in perspective with depth, which looks like three dimensions, then it can help you design, for example, buildings, architecture, and visualize how is it going to be before it's even built. This is what, for example, Bramante did with this church in Italy. It turned out this way. When you enter, you see the space and you feel, okay, this is a very normal church, right? Nothing to see. But when you're closer to the altar, you see that it's actually very flat. The church doesn't extend beyond the altar. It was just an impression, an appearance that you got when you entered it. By the way, this is another example of how painting relates to architecture, because without that painting and the perspective technique, it wouldn't have been possible. This is another example, a theater also in Italy, which, you may see it's a beautiful theater, but nothing too impressive. But actually, yes, because it's built this way to give you the illusion of depth when there actually isn't. So this was a tool that was very used in the Renaissance.
Wait, I'm trying to understand. What is the...
So
explain that.
So what they're doing is sloping both the floor and the roof.
This is the stage of the theater?
Yes. This is kind of the behind the scenes, where the actors come into the stage through these halls,
so
which
this
are
is like the background of the play.
Yeah, but you can see the actors come into stage from these corridors.
You think that
so you can imagine them walking in a city, right? Turning the corner and appearing there, but they're actually just a couple of meters away.
Very interesting.
Now, we did mention that the Renaissance was all about revisiting Greek and Roman architecture and arts in general, and finding some principles there that we can then replicate. But that doesn't mean that good architecture can only be this way and there is no room for improvement or imagination or creativity. On the contrary, I want to talk a little bit about this character, Antoni Gaudi, who was very interesting and very controversial uh, in the history of architecture. He developed a very unique style that at least I hadn't seen before. Gaudi's architecture is very symbolic, right? He showed us that you can have fun with architecture. You can have these ideas that are non-conventional. Like, for example, you want a building that resembles the sea world, and you can uh, make it with a lot of colors and shapes that are uh, very natural, very organic, right? You can even include elements that uh, make you think of bones or skulls or things like that that are not common since that
Well,
that
from what I understood, he's not classified as any school, but his own school of architecture, Gaudi style. It's not modern. It's not anything. It's just
yeah
it's Gaudi.
his sui generis, yes. um because uh, the way I see it, he's just trying to have fun and put a lot of symbols up there that he likes. And so he figures out how to do it in terms of the structure of the building and how are you going to make it so it doesn't collapse. And then, yeah, you can add a lot of colors and shapes that you like. Uh, but yeah, he's kind of outside the box, and people get very confused when they try to talk about him.
Yeah,
Um,
from everyone that I talked to about Gaudi and everyone who has came to Barcelona to see his building, they have very strong emotional reactions to Gaudi's buildings, and they fall in love with them the minute they step inside. I would be able to tell myself, perceptually, it does look very weird, and I'm not sure how to swallow this. You know, it's so unusual that
yeah,
you're not sure what to say about it.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, it's, I mean, he creates his own world and he creates these uh, atmospheres, let's say, where you find yourself surrounded with color and shapes that you're not used to. And again, all these symbols, if you see the image at the top, this is a building that, as many buildings do, they need to have a lot of facilities, and it's like the dirty part of architecture, right? You don't want to look at all the ventilation systems and water tanks and all these things that are kind of ugly. So
Mm.
this is the of that building, and well, he converted this, he transformed this uh, ugly things, let's say, into sculptures. And you may think about them as being warriors or maybe chess pieces, right? Like pawns,
Yeah.
and then you're suddenly in a giant chessboard, and it's all about creating those atmospheres, those settings, and making you feel those things, right?
Well, one of the things that I like about creating movies is creating that atmosphere, creating a unique atmospherical experience that is capable of evoking emotions when the viewer is entering kind of when you're appreciating a work of art, you're entering into the mind of the artist pretty much. And when the artist is able to take you on a on a journey, on an atmospherical journey into his own mind, into his own state of mind, into his sense of life, I find this very interesting.
Yes, sure. And well, this is the example of the Sagrada Familia, which is it hasn't been finished yet, but again, we're completely surrounded by this atmosphere created by Gaudi, um, this uh, this architecture that imitates nature, right? The columns are literally trees. They have branches and they hold the roofs. And the way he treated the light coming into the building, right? It almost feels as the light coming through the leaves of trees in a forest, right?
Yeah, it's also it reminds me of when I see a cathedral like that. I think of the the Gothic cathedrals with their huge ceiling. But this time it's very different. Also the colors. I like the use of color here and
Yes,
light.
and it hmm and it's also, I mean, I look at these pictures and I think about two things. One, it's beautiful. I like it. I have a positive response to it. And the second one is it's amazing that human beings did this, that a human mind like Gaudi designed this, that it holds, that uh, these columns work as columns and bring the structural loads to the ground. Uh, the fact that we as humans can create this is just amazing, right?
Yeah.
It's very powerful. One thing that I wanted to mention is
Okay.
that also part of doing good architecture is uh, looking for the details, right? An
Uh,
architect must be acquainted, must know every part of the building, basically. He must know how to build it. And that's what the great architects of history did, right? They were both the designers and the builders. Uh,
yeah. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, he designed all of the furniture in his buildings.
yeah, yeah, that's very common to see architects that also, yeah, this idea of integral, a design that integrates everything, even the furniture and the landscape sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, an architect must know what he's dealing with, uh, and how to
Does he
how
also
to
have to be an engineer?
in a sense, yes. He has to know the technology that's necessary for him to materialize, to concretize the building. Because at first you have kind of the idea of the building. You may say you have the drawings. Nowadays you have the 3D model in a computer maybe, or the physical 3D model. When
Right.
you have to translate that into an actual building, you have to at least have a general idea of the technology that's going to be required of you in order to accomplish that. Because building a building is not an easy task,
No.
and there are many things that can go wrong, and to what one should pay attention. We have seen how Gaudi played with colors and materials and shapes. That's something that I generally like. I think it's a good idea if done rationally. So in this case, for example, the building is a museum, and it because it's a museum, it can permit itself to have these weird shapes, this circular or curved facade. I like the fact that it has a lot of wood and natural light coming in, because if you think about it, these are very natural resources, both wood and the natural light of the sun. Uh, but it's rearranged in a way that it creates a space that's habitable for humans, that is comfortable, without losing that natural element, right? It's a very explicit way of showing that we humans control nature and we can do this with wood and the natural resources that we have on hand. This is another example that I find interesting. I'm not sure I particularly like it, but I like this thing about it. If you are going for a building that is very transparent, very open, very fluid, and have the inside and the outside kind of merged together, then I think this is a very good solution for this. There is a lot of technical knowledge that one must know in order to build this. Just look at that glass and how it has virtually no joints, and you see no mullions or no structure holding that glass, because actually the glass doesn't need a structure. But that was studied by the architect, and he came up with this. And I also like the fact that this building, which is very transparent and white and contemporary looking, is in a certain context. It's set in a small city in Spain, and I like that the architect designed another piece. He designed two architectural pieces, let's say, the building itself and a shell that kind of surrounds the building and makes the transition from the city that looks one way and his building that looks another way.
I don't know if I like it. It has some. It looks a bit like a prison to me.
Well, it actually is a building for workers, for people who work at the government of the city.
Okay. So it's not that.
So draw your own conclusions. But at least the fact that he created a transition between his building and the rest of the city, because they look very different. That idea I like, and I think it's a good one. And we can also see that over here, for example, this is in London, and the building that you see in the left picture, it doesn't particularly stand out, right? The colors are very earthy colors or gray, and it kind of goes along harmonically with the rest of the city. It would be a very different thing if this building were in Rio de Janeiro, for example, in Brazil or in Mexico or in some other colorful city.
Yeah.
But it's in London. So does this mean that all buildings should be gray and boring? No, because as you see in the other image in the right, you can have a lot of craziness and be creative with shapes and materials, but towards the inside of the building, right? Because you create your own world. I like the idea of you creating your own world. But that world that you create, let's say, has to be in harmony with its surroundings. So you can do almost whatever you want in the inside, but then adjust the outside to the context.
Yeah, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel every building that you create.
Yeah, exactly. There are things that work and that have worked for millennia, and it's good to take them and use them because they work for a reason.
Right.
But sometimes also a building has to stand out from its context. Let's say it's a museum, a very special museum for some reason, on a, let's say, a mediocre urban setting, just to put it that way. Okay, then the question is, how do I make my building stand out? Do I make it with a weird shape and a weird color and material and very big? No, because that would be taking all the variables, all the possible variables, and making them kind of the opposite of what exists already. In this case, the building was a museum, and it has to stand out from an urban context of small houses, right? Which seem like little blocks. Okay, so the museum also looks like little blocks. uh, dispersed in the space, right?
Uh,
It's not one giant block. It's not red, right? Uh, but it played with the materials, so it has a lot of wood, and that's the way you stand out, right? You take one or two variables and you make them different from the context. For example, material or color. But the there is still a sense of scale, right, and of proportions uh, that should be taken into account. It's not that you can do anything you like and it will be harmonious, because it won't. And then again, towards the inside, you can do whatever you want, basically, and have fun.
I like this example. It's a shame, that many modern art buildings can be very beautiful, but their content is horrible. Why can't they build a regular museum with with modern architecture? Um, I don't
Yeah,
see.
sometimes it's better to go to the modern art museums, but just to look at the building, because that's a real piece of art sometimes. Yeah, there are lots of modern art museums that are gorgeous, or at least interesting. But then sometimes you find yourself designing a building in a very dense urban context like Manhattan, and in that case, adjusting to the context and making a building in harmony with surroundings means building a skyscraper, for example. And in many cases, it is appropriate to build a skyscraper. Um, there are things still to take into consideration. Okay, what will the general shape be like? Is it going to be like a rectangle, and then you extrude it up and that's it? So it's like a shoebox, only taller, or does it have like different volumes? And well, in this case, this building, I like it because it creates uh, sort of terraces at different levels.
I really
Um,
like it. It's very elegant. The I think.
yes, it's elegant, and it doesn't need to be very flashy, right? Sometimes uh, you can find good design in simple things, which also, I'm not saying this is a simple building, because a building this big is very complex, but yeah, you don't need flashy in order
No,
to
absolutely
have good
not.
design.
I am pro elegance. Absolutely always. So we have gone through the history of architecture. We have been to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Italy, all over the world, Scandinavia, Turkey, New York. What a journey you have taken us, Franco. Okay, so I want to thank you for this. It's been enlightening, and I think it's a very important form of art, architecture, of course, as we mentioned. I myself need to do a lot. I need to study it much more in order to talk about it more seriously. But you, of course, you possess very interesting knowledge, and I'm very glad that you shared it with us today. Um, Anything you want to add?
No, thank you very much for having me. It was very fun. Maybe if I can just leave you with a thought about the
Please.
importance of architecture, right? Because if you live in a city, uh, every every activity that you engage in every day of your life happens uh, surrounded by architecture, right? It happens either in a building or between buildings, like in the street or in a park, right?
Right.
So architecture is something that's around us all the time, and that's what I really like about it. It's very important to have good design, because you live with it your entire life, basically. So, yeah.
That's great. I've always, well, quite recently, I'm starting to appreciate more architecture. Just perhaps an advice to our viewers: try to walk around your city. It must have at least one pretty building. There are many beautiful buildings here in Tel Aviv, I think. If some of my American friends or European friends are much more lucky if they live in a big city. Europeans, especially, even in small villages, they can find beautiful architecture there. Okay, so thank you very much, Franco. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun, and that's it, right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.